Small caps offer hefty potential for returns, but as many punters know, they also come with extra risk. Adding to that risk is the limited research available on the sector. Grant Lowton is from Vunani Private Clients. He's in studio and he's been involved all day with a showcase at the JSE on small caps. Welcome, Grant. And it's a good to, so Viv just keeping you company here, Viv being your colleague, so having warmed up the studio for you. So what are the particular qualities with characteristics of small caps? So we spoke about the risk, so high volatility and uncertainty.
Well, yeah, I mean, just for one, if you look at the 10 years ending September 2012, the small cap index was up 550% compared to the top 40 that is up 250%. So you can see the quantum there in terms of how levered they are in terms of, upside potential. Having said that, of course, there are risks at times. I think there's a common misconception that higher risk equals higher potential return, and that's not always the case. I mean, higher risk sometimes just purely means higher risk. So if you're going into something with, that has historically been more risky and could be going forward, it doesn't mean it's necessarily more exciting. It just means it could be plainly a stupid bet to get into. I mean, in terms of small caps, you've got to particularly look at whether there's a good fundamental story. You've got to look at, your earnings potential going forward, et cetera, and also potentially at times you've got to look at if there's a turnaround potential in a particular company. So often as analysts and portfolio managers, you get stuck on the quantitative side of things, which is obviously your numbers and so forth. But with small caps, where you often don't have much of a history going back, you have to definitely look at a lot of qualitative factors. So
more touchy-feely. What's the management like?
Exactly. I mean, you look at the management, you look at the strategy of the company, management's ability possibly to execute on that. Those sorts of things become very important when there is a lack of track record.
So that return that you refer to now over the past 10 years, I mean, I think that the term survivorship bias comes to mind. So that doesn't reflect the fact that many of those small businesses might have closed shop and disappeared. Yeah,
I mean, look, that sort of survivorship bias, that applies to whether you're looking at performance of hedge funds or whatever it is across the board. I'm not sure to what extent it might apply to something like a small cap index, though. I think, that's sort of the value of the incumbent companies. When a particular company would fall out, I would imagine that the index would compensate for that and come off, to that extent. So I wouldn't say that necessarily applies that much in that regard.
Steve, what's your appetite for small caps, and perhaps you have a question for Grant?
No, I think that one's got to be there. I think even your normal investment clients should have allocate a small part of their portfolio to these. We need, as an investing public and investing market, to evaluate them intelligently. I suppose the question is, what are your top picks right now?
Well, at the moment, in our particular small cap portfolio, we have Ellie's and Invicta as a couple of the top picks. We like the stories there. We like the potential going forward. In fact, Ellie's we included just yesterday, even though at the moment it's going pretty much sideways. But the Vunani small cap analyst in particular as well does like that one. Important, as I've just alluded to, at the moment it's going sideways. In terms of entry point, very important when you get into a stock. It's a balancing act, effectively. You would like to wait for the stock to come off a little bit, and enter at some sort of ideal point. But at the same time, if it is running away from you to some extent, you need to at some point just make the decision and do the trade. Otherwise, 10–15% later, you're still waiting for the thing to come off, and that's sort of some of the art involved in trading, particularly with small caps.
In other words, you're betting it's going to mature, it's going to grow until it matures into maybe a mid cap.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I think another one of the advantages that needs to be made very clear in terms of small caps is that, say you've got a company worth, say, call it 2–3 billion rand. If you have an institutional, a portfolio manager or institutional trader who needs to, he's got about R1 billion in cash that he has to implement. He actually is not permitted to go into companies that are smaller than a certain size because of liquidity constraints. I mean, he would have to bid that price up, an unreasonable amount in order to actually get into that stock. So my point is that as retail investors, that's where retail investors can actually sort of have a win, if you want to call it that,
yes,
over the institutions, because they can, you know, get into some of the smaller shares that have, you know, great potential upside before, you know, or to the exclusion of some institutional players.
Yes, we've got to find the next data. It was a small cap in the late 80s.
Yes.
Very small.
And I think it's an important point that you make, that that's really the opportunity for the retail players. And I think many individual retail punters see that. So as you say, the big players aren't allowed to go there. The research isn't available. It's not liquid enough. So the retail players can go there, Viv.
Oh, yes, most certainly. I mean, also look at the small cap portfolio. I mean, you talk about a large cap portfolio, you usually have sector allocation and you work down. Do you use a similar philosophy when you look at a small cap portfolio? Do you look at diversification across sectors, or do you just look at which companies you think are best overall and buy them?
Look, obviously, I mean, in terms of, you know, conventional portfolio construction, you would you would make the sector allocation decision first, primarily due to the fact that within any particular sector, these shares tend to be very correlated. So you'd make that decision first, and then obviously drill down into the particular stocks. However, in terms of the small cap portfolio, we don't do that. We select purely. We are stock pickers on that portfolio completely, and we go with the stocks that we believe have the best potential going forward.
Grant, typically with these small cap stocks, they aren't dividend payers. Is that right?
Well, a lot of them aren't. Some of them may, you know, pay a small dividend, but, you know, obviously you've got a company that's in its infancy stage, you know, some of the time, and they're looking to expand and that sort of thing. They, you know, companies obviously much further down the line that are more towards the cash cow stage. That would be where they start paying dividends. Certainly not while they're still, you know, growing up, so to speak.
And mining small caps?
Yeah, I mean, those are, I think, you know, combine mining or resources with small cap, and you sort of got the ultimate sort of mix of potentially risky. So we don't like to speculate, and I think in terms of our portfolio, it's predominantly in the industrial space,
yes,
actually.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I think one needs a specialized kind of investor for the mining small caps, and in markets like this, it's really tough for them.
Yeah.
Grant, you very briefly alluded to some of your picks. You said Ellie's and Invicta. Could you choose one of those, or perhaps a third, and just give us some detail? How would you look at it? What are the metrics that you looked at, and why you liked them?
Well, certainly, you know, as I was alluding to at the JSE presentation earlier, spoke a little bit about Ellie's. Often when it comes to small caps, you think, you know, what is the company that has the next sort of big thing, to put it like that. But, you know, that doesn't have to be the case. Something like Ellie's, they're involved in TVs, remotes, aerials, day-to-day things that, you know, we all sort of don't even think about really. And if a company like that can execute a strategy whereby something that has such simple yet a good demand for that particular product, that's the sort of thing that you want to look at, you know, to form, at least to some extent, the core of your portfolio. In terms of metrics, yeah, I mean, it's quite tough to place all your sort of faith in quantitative aspects, as I've said earlier, in terms of small caps, because sometimes not much of a history, forecasts. I mean, some analysts, even with regards to big caps, or some portfolio managers, don't place any, you know, they don't really care what the forecasts are. So certainly in terms of small caps, they become even less important because they could be even more inaccurate. So once again, management and company strategy and that sort of thing.
And management.
Management and management.